and welcome back to Bengal Bites, a podcast about the Cincinnati Bengals from a real, raw, unfiltered perspective. I'm your host, Derek. This is episode 35, the Week 16 recap, where the Cincinnati Bengals went into Pittsburgh and got defeated, unfortunately. In this episode, we're going to break down this horrible, miserable, painful game and try to take some positives out of it, as we do in all of our episodes. And unfortunately, there's going to be probably more negatives than positives, but we'll start off with the positives, start off on a good foot before we get into some of the less optimistic parts of this game. But not all hope is lost. Bengals still have a chance to make the playoffs this season if they can win out their remaining two games, but it's going to be a lot harder than it would have been if they had won this game. If you're brand new to this podcast, go back and check out episode 0 where I explain more about who I am, why I'm making this show. But basically, I'm a former college football player, lifelong fan of the Bengals, and I wanted to make a podcast about the Bengals from an outsider, unbiased perspective. Now, the reason I wanted to do that is because leading up to this game against the Steelers, we had heard a lot of noise and chatter around the league and around the media about how well Jake Browning was playing, how Jake Browning looked just like Joe Burrow, and how everything for the Bengals was going so well because they'd won 3 games in a row. People were saying, oh, Jake Browning is playing at such a high level and all this stuff. It's like, did these people actually watch the game? It's like Jake Browning was getting super lucky in most of these games. He was not playing at a Joe Burrow-like level. It's kind of an insult for anybody to even compare Jake Browning to Joe Burrow just because they both play for the Bengals and they're both quarterbacks. Jake Browning is not anything like Joe Burrow, so let's not get that confused. We all saw that in this game, but maybe that's one positive we can start off with right now is we don't have to worry about the Bengals trading away Joe Burrow for Jake Browning. Let's all rest assured that Joe Burrow is going to be the Bengals quarterback from here on out for the foreseeable future. There's not going to be any quarterback controversy. This game should pretty much put that to rest with anybody who had any questions or was trying to fool themselves, delude themselves into thinking that Jake Browning was going to be some kind of diamond in the rough quarterback like Brock Purdy. Now, Brock Purdy himself had a 4-interception game, maybe even worse than the game Jake Browning had, but still, those interceptions were different. Like, if you look at them on the stat sheet, they both say interceptions, but the way that they got these interceptions were much different. Jake Browning was just making very poor decisions in the game. Brock Purdy just got kind of bad luck in a lot of them where the ball got tipped to the line of scrimmage, tipped up in the air. It wasn't a bad read by Brock Purdy. He just, bad luck, got an interception. That can happen. The plays that Jake Browning were making in this game against the Steelers, and we'll get to later, were just horrible, as he called them in his own words, dumb decisions. Jake Browning called them dumb decisions. He said you can't win a game throwing 3 interceptions, and he's absolutely right. He pretty much lost this game for the Bengals. But there was a lot of other bad performances by the Bengals, especially on defense. Absolutely terrible on defense. Embarrassing performance by them. Like I said, let's get to some of the positives before we get to all the negatives that happened in the rest of this game. The Bengals ended up losing this game 34-11. But in a lot of ways, it felt very similar to the first game they had against the Steelers. Even though the score was much different, the vibe and the feeling of the game, the way it progressed throughout. The Steelers in the first game, they had over 400 yards of offense for the first time in a number of years, ran the ball up and down the field on the Bengals, just got a few turnovers and missed opportunities where they should have and could have scored a lot more points than 16 against the Bengals in the last game. Bengals in this game had pretty much a similar performance on offense. The only difference was they scored a 2-point conversion instead of kicking an extra point. So they got 11 points instead of 10 points. 1 more point than they did previously. But for the Bengals' perspective, this game was almost a carbon copy of the first game. Just looked horrible throughout. They got their ass kicked all the way through the game. Not a whole lot of good things. But there were some positives we can take out of this game. Number one among the positives was the fact that T. Higgins did step up as we had needed and hoped that he would with Jamar Chase being out. They needed another strong performance with T. Higgins, and they got it. T. Higgins was their Bengals' leading receiver. 5 catches off of 8 targets for T. Higgins for 140 yards and 1 touchdown, including the longest catch of T. Higgins' career, an 80-yard touchdown where he just got out into the open field. Nobody got a hand on him. He had just wide open green grass all the way to the end zone, and T. Higgins showed off some speed that I didn't even think he had. He ran away from everybody on the field. I don't know if everybody was really chasing him as hard as they could be, but T showed off his speed. He got away from everybody, scored his longest touchdown ever, and that was pretty much the highlight of the Bengals game. There wasn't a whole lot of other positive plays, but this play from T. Higgins was a great one. On top of that one outstanding catch, we did see a number of other tough contested catches along the sidelines. There was some 3rd and long, like 3rd and 10, 3rd and 15 plays where they needed a conversion, and T. Higgins was there to get it down inbounds for them and make the tough catch. That's what we needed out of T. Higgins. One other receiver who stepped up in Jamar Chase's absence was the rookie Andrei Iosivas. Iosivas had 8 targets, 4 receptions for 36 yards, a long of 12. He did have a couple nice catches to convert first downs on 3rd downs. Couple drops or missed opportunities for Andrei Iosivas. So the 8 targets and only 4 receptions, a couple missed opportunities. But overall, I thought Andre did a good job of, getting in there as a rookie, getting some good quality snaps against a tough opponent. He showed that he could get open, he could get separation from the defensive backs, so there wasn't like there was guys all over him. He was getting open. So we'd like to see, Andre come down with some of those bigger plays, make some bigger plays like T. Higgins did. Like if we can get Andrei Iosivas in the open field, he's even faster than T, so I'm sure he could take it 80 yards if he got the opportunity as well. It's just that some of these passes to Andrei Iosivas, there's one that was behind him, one way over his head, one out of bounds. So there's not a lot of good passes from Jake Browning to Andrei Iosivas to really show what he can do, but he was making the most out of the opportunities that he had. It was a decent day for Tyler Boyd, 5 catches on 7 targets for 59 yards, no touchdown. But Tyler Boyd did have a long of 29, where it was similar to the catch Tyler Boyd had against the Jets last year or 2 years ago, where he caught it, got hit immediately by the defender, but Tyler Boyd has such good balance and strength. He didn't go down. He just stayed on his feet. The defender bounced right off of him. Tyler Boyd kept running for another 15 or 20 yards before he got tackled. Tyler Boyd's still a tough player. He's playing in Pittsburgh, which is his home city. He went to high school and college in the city of Pittsburgh, so he's got a lot of fans there still. I know Tyler wanted to have a good performance in his homecoming to Pittsburgh, but these Steelers, it's like this year especially, they had the Bengals number. One other positive before we get to some of the negatives and some of the other things going on in this game, I'll say one positive was Brad Robbins, the punter, probably had one of his best punting performances of the year so far, and definitely his best individual punt. The last punt of the game, Brad Robbins got it checked up inside the 5-yard line. It looked like it was maybe going to go into the end zone for a touchback, but Brad had a perfect kind of backspin on it, like a golf ball going up onto the golf green. He got it to do a little backspin, came out to about the 5-yard line. That was a good job of pinning the Steelers' offense deep into their own territory. And as it turned out, the Steelers fumbled the snap on that next play, and if they hadn't had got the ball out of the end zone, that would have been a safety for the Bengals. So that almost worked out in the Bengals' favor. The only thing about that was at that point in the game, there was only like 4 or 5 minutes left in the game, and the Bengals were down by 23 points. So punting the ball away didn't really make any difference whether they punted it, took a knee, went for it, whatever was going to happen, the Bengals were still going to lose. So it's too bad that Brad Robbins' best punt of the year was in a situation where it didn't even really matter. But hey, anything we can get out of this game that was a positive, we'll take it. So good job, Brad Robbins, improving in the punts, because we have seen some inconsistencies, some short punting. That's kind of the rap. Even the announcers in this game were like, Brad Robbins, not the strongest leg, but he's got the hang time. So the word is out on Brad Robbins, weak punting leg. So he's going to have to work on that. Maybe we can get Brad Robbins to hit the weights in the offseason. He can get the punting distance up there. But in this game, decent punting job by Brad Robbins. I'll give it to him. And I think that's about where the positivity in this episode is going to conclude. I went back and listened to the previous episode, and I was struck by how cynical I sounded. I thought I was really optimistic going into the game, but when I listened to the episode, I sounded really cynical, and probably for good reason. The Steelers had just beat the Bengals at Paycor Stadium 4 weeks ago. So it wasn't like these were completely different teams just because the Bengals had won 3 games in a row and the Steelers had lost 3 games in a row. It's not like they were just totally different franchises now that they're going to play each other again in Pittsburgh. So we shouldn't have expected too much of a different outcome, especially because the Bengals were going to be without their 2 best players in Jamar Chase and DJ Reader. Their best offensive player and their best defensive player were both going to be out for this game. There's not really, addition by subtraction when you get into losing your best skill players on both sides of the ball. So that's probably one of the reasons why I wasn't overly optimistic heading into this game. Just going into it, the weather in this game wasn't looking good. And the Bengals have not won a game in the AFC North division so far this year. This loss takes the Bengals to 0-5. They're going to have one last opportunity in Week 18 against the Browns to get a divisional win. But so far, they're 0-5. And it's like all these teams in the division, this is their 5th year of playing against Zach Taylor and this coaching staff. For the most part, the Bengals have had the same coaching staff all 5 of Zach Taylor's years coaching. And it seems at this point that all the other teams in the division have pretty much figured out what the Bengals team wants to do. The other teams, the Bengals opponents, have downloaded Zach Taylor and Brian Callahan. They've figured out what their game plan and scheme is going to be. The other teams seem like they have a pretty solid idea of how to beat the Bengals at this point, and that's what the other teams have done. None of these games have even really been close. The Browns game, they blew the Bengals away. The Ravens games, they blew the Bengals away. And the Steelers now have blown the Bengals away 2 games in a row. Even though the first game was within 6 points, Steelers really could have scored a lot more points on the Bengals, it felt like. So this second game where the Bengals lost 34-11 felt very similar to the first game. The only difference was the score, like I said. So there's a lot to be said for continuity, and that's all great. You don't want to fire people and overturn the apple cart if it's working. But on the other hand, maybe they do need to change something up or get some fresh ideas, something. Because if you're going to get to the playoffs, you have to be able to beat the teams in your division and in your own conference. And if the other teams are so familiar with this team that they can just basically count on a win against the Bengals, it's going to make it very hard to advance out of your own conference, out of your own division, and get back to that Super Bowl that we all want for the Bengals. Now, whatever you want to say about the scheme, part of it also has to do with the players. The coaches can call whatever plays they want, but it's up to the players to execute the plays. And in this game, just in general, we could see that, I don't want to say it was a lack of effort, but for whatever reason, the Bengals just didn't have the same level of intensity. They weren't, I don't know, it's hard to say that they weren't prepared as players, but you could just tell, like, the Steelers came out and they were just running the ball up and down the field on the Bengals, pretty much could do whatever they wanted. Bengals couldn't get anything going, so it was just like 2 totally opposite looking teams. The aggression, the intensity wasn't there for the Bengals. I heard in an interview with Mike Hilton after the game that after the Steelers scored their first long touchdown, we'll get to that in a second, it was an 86-yard touchdown, basically identical carbon copy to the T. Higgins play, but George Pickens got the first touchdown before T. Higgins. Nobody on the Bengals pretty much got a hand on George Pickens all the way down the field. Looks like some Keystone Cops routine where the Bengals were colliding with each other and falling down and taking each other out. Just an embarrassing opening to the game. And so stuff like that, it was just like, what are the Bengals doing? Are they prepared? Do they really want to play? Mike Hilton was saying, after the touchdown, they were deflated on the sidelines. The mood on the sideline was down, and kind of, after that, it was hard to get back into the game. Well, that was like the first couple minutes of the game. So if they were already down and deflated right as the game started, you got to think they were probably thinking that heading into this game. It wasn't like, one bad play really just soured everybody's mood. Probably mentally, Bengals players were checked out even before this game started. So why is that? Part of that is on the coaches for not getting them into this. Part of the fact is this has been a long, grueling season where every game has been a must-win pretty much. They've had to win. They've done a good job of getting 3 wins in a row and stringing these wins together. But, psychologically, it's hard for all the players to get themselves psyched up and motivated every single week. Okay, we got to win. We got to win. You just get tired and worn out and stressed out from all that. And especially because Jake Browning, the week right before this, he's coming off an emotional high where we saw him. He beat the Minnesota Vikings, his old team that cut him. He had every reason in the world to want to get revenge, get back at the team that he felt like did him wrong. That's all great, but then there's got to be a come down. There's a little bit of a hangover after all that emotion for Jake Browning. Now, okay, you got to come back the next week and play again and do it again and do it again. That's what being a professional is all about. So I don't fault Jake Browning for not having his best performance in this game, but it's just one of those things where you'll have ebbs and flows throughout the season. You can't always have every game being a must-win. From here on out, these last 2 games are going to be must-win, so it's going to be up to the Bengals coaches and players to make sure that this is not something that lingers and carries over week to week. Maybe, hopefully, this is just the Steelers are better than the Bengals. This is a bad matchup for the Bengals. They won't have to play the Steelers, anymore unless they somehow meet in the playoffs. But they've got to worry about the Chiefs this week and then the Browns after that. No more Steelers. So maybe we can say, okay, TJ Watt, Alex Highsmith, those guys, because they obviously whooped up on the Bengals tackles. Jonah Williams at right tackle, Orlando Brown at left tackle. They did not have good games in this game. They gave up sacks, gave up pressure. There was hands in Jake Browning's face, trying to tip the ball away, sack him. But that's what we saw in the first game against the Steelers. That wasn't really that much of a surprise either. We know what TJ Watt can do. He's going to be a future Hall of Fame player. We know that Jonah Williams is not. So it's not like a surprise that TJ Watt was dominating Jonah Williams. That's what we expected to happen. That's what happened the first game, and it happened again. We won't have to play him anymore. So we can hopefully say, okay, it's a one-off. Steelers, they got us this year, but maybe the Chiefs. Maybe we'll have a better matchup against the Chiefs. I can't really say that for sure because the Chiefs have Chris Jones. The Browns have Myles Garrett. So we're starting to get into some more of these tough defensive line matchups that have not gone the way of the Bengals in the past couple of years. But we'll have to see about those upcoming games. In this game, the thing that we knew was going to be a challenge was running the ball. The first matchup against the Steelers, the Bengals only had a total of 25 rushing yards the entire game. I think Joe Mixon had something like 8 for 16. In the first half for the Bengals, they had 8 rushing attempts for 16 yards. Didn't really get any better. For the whole game, the Bengals had 59 rushing yards. They got a little bit more success in the second half. Joe Mixon had a couple 10, 12-yard runs. I think Chase Brown had a couple runs here and there. So they got a little bit more. 59 yards is better than 25. But still, they almost got doubled up by the Steelers, who had 113 rushing yards. When they wanted to, the Steelers were able to run the ball effectively with Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren. But if we just look at the plays for passing versus running the ball, the Bengals threw the ball 42 times and only had 16 rushing attempts for the entire game. Almost 3-1 passing to running the ball. 2.5-1, basically. I know that the Bengals were down by a lot of points. They were down by 24-0 at halftime. So in that situation, it's obvious you're going to need to throw the ball more than run the ball. But even then, 42 times throwing the ball for Jake Browning is not going to be successful. That's why he's a backup quarterback in the NFL. He showed in this game why he's a backup quarterback. Nothing more, nothing less. There were some plays that he made that were good, competent NFL caliber throws where you're like, oh, that is an NFL level throw. That's an NFL quarterback right there. But there were some other throws where they were misreads. He got fooled a number of times by the Steelers' zone defense, as they did in the first game. And like I said, they weren't balls where they got tipped up in the air and intercepted or went through a receiver's hands and got intercepted. Like there was the pick six that Jake Browning threw a couple weeks ago to Tanner Hudson, where it just went through Tanner Hudson's hands straight into the defender's arms and he ran for a touchdown. There weren't any of those type of fluke interceptions for Jake Browning. These were all straight up bad decisions, poor misreads by Jake Browning, especially the first one. We'll get into that later. But as bad and as ineffective as the Bengals offense was, it was really the turnovers, the interceptions by Jake Browning that were the nail in the coffin. It's kind of ironic, Dan Horde's trademark phrase is coffin nails. Well, the coffin nails in this game were Jake Browning throwing those 3 interceptions. Pittsburgh did not have any turnovers in this game. Bengals were not able to force any interceptions. They weren't even really close to forcing any. There was maybe the one play in the end zone where it looked like maybe they were going to get the safety because the Steelers fumbled, but they didn't get that. There was one other play where the ball got tipped up in the air, and it looked like maybe the Bengals were going to be able to come down with the interception, but the Steelers got fortunate on that play where they caught the ball and kept it away from the Bengals. So Bengals really didn't force any fumbles, didn't really get any close to interceptions, so the defense couldn't force anything, and unfortunately the offense for the Bengals gave it away. If you're -3 in the turnover ratio, that's usually, 95 or more percent of the time you're going to lose the game. That was the story in this game. Even though it wasn't a revenge game for Jake Browning or anybody on the Bengals necessarily, I mean, we could say Mike Hilton maybe was a little bit of a revenge game because he used to play on the Steelers, but also the Steelers defensive coordinator used to be the defensive coordinator for the Bengals. He was the defensive coordinator in Marvin Lewis's last year. This is Terrell Austin, Steelers defensive coordinator now. Terrell Austin used to be the Bengals defensive coordinator. He got fired in 2018, so there's probably a little bit of a revenge factor for him. He wants to come in and show that he's a good defensive coordinator. Bengals shouldn't have fired him that last year, and he wants to have a good performance against his old team, and he was able to do that. So he probably won't come out and say it, but there's probably a revenge factor for him in terms of shutting Zach Taylor and Brian Callahan's offense down for his former team. I don't want to kill Jake Browning too bad because in the grand scheme of things, he is still relatively young and he's only making his 5th start in the NFL. But we'd hope to see a little bit better performance this time around against the Steelers than his first game. We kind of gave him a free pass because his first start in the NFL was against the Steelers in the rain and he lost and it wasn't a good performance. So he and everybody has been talking about how he wanted to improve since then. And he had said, well, since they won the games, he had so much better idea of what to expect and how to prepare and all this kind of stuff. But the end result in this game was not any better than the first game. So maybe that was somewhat valid in terms of getting more experience, knowing what to do. But maybe the Steelers just know how to play against the Bengals, know how to play against Jake Browning. And it wouldn't have mattered how much experience Jake Browning had. It maybe wouldn't have mattered if Joe Burrow would have played in this game. Maybe the Steelers would have done just the same thing. I don't know. Outside of Jake Browning, there were a number of bad performances on offense and defense. On offense, the offensive line didn't play especially well up front. They weren't really creating any space for Joe Mixon and the other running backs to get anywhere on the running game. They were giving up pressure on the outside and up the middle. The receivers weren't blocking especially well when they were doing screens, and there was a lot of screens in this game. I think after the first quarter or so, the Bengals had run about 5 screens, it felt like. And the Steelers weren't fooled. After the first couple, the first couple had a success to Joe Mixon and Drew Sample. They picked up 8 yards. But then after that, the screen game was not going anywhere. Part of the reason is if you are going to try to run a screen, the screen is only going to be effective if the defense is very aggressive, pushing upfield at you. You can kind of lure them in, hit the screen behind them, and have plenty of open field. Well, the Steelers were just sitting back, waiting for the Bengals to throw the screens. They weren't really being that aggressive coming upfield. They didn't have to be. So they would just sit back and wait for the Bengals to throw out to the flat, throw a screen behind the line of scrimmage, and then just go tackle them. And the Bengals weren't able to make the blocks, break tackles to get away from the defense to get anywhere on these screens for most of the time. So that wasn't working. And then on offense, when the Bengals tried to throw the ball down the field, they didn't have too much success. Jake Browning was just off on a lot of his throws in this game. He was throwing behind receivers, over their heads, throwing it out of bounds. And then on Jake Browning's first interception, this was mind-blowing to me. He said he was trying to throw the ball out of bounds, but he accidentally threw it inbounds, which is unbelievable. Because I was like, oh, he threw that. He must have been trying to throw a touchdown. Surely, as an NFL quarterback, he's got the accuracy and the precision to not just randomly throw the ball at the Steelers defenders for an easy interception. But after the game, that's pretty much what he said happened. He said he was trying to throw the ball away, and somehow it just ended up in the middle of the end zone, right in the Steelers defenders' hands. Which is it's just mind-blowingly frustrating because, you want to give him the benefit of the doubt, be like, okay, surely he wouldn't have just throwing that. Maybe he saw somebody in the end zone. He was trying to make a play, trying to get something going. But if he was trying to throw it out of bounds and he missed by that much that it ended up going into the end zone, like, how does it happen? If you're a professional quarterback, how do you try to throw it out of bounds, but you miss and throw it inbounds? Like, did his hand cramp up again? Did something happen, like, in the most critical moment of the game where it's like, whoops, I accidentally threw it to the Steelers? So, like, right off the bat, that was the backbreaker because let's go back. Let's relive the beginning of this game because it was over pretty much from the beginning. The Bengals came out on their first drive. They got the ball first. They picked up a couple first downs. Things were looking okay. Like I mentioned, they got a couple screens going in there, picked up some yards. They even got a third down conversion to Andre Iosivas. Iosivas ran, he was one-on-one in the boundary with the cornerback. He ran a pretty good route. He ran about an 8 to 10 yard curl route, stopped, came back. Jake Browning hit him with the ball, mostly on time, maybe a little bit late, but he got the ball to Iosivas. He made the catch, got the first down. After that, the drive kind of stalled out. They had to punt. Second play, after the Steelers got the ball back, and it was a decent punt by Brad Robbins. He got it inside the 10. Steelers ran one short running play. Then the second down play, the Bengals had 5 defensive linemen in the game because the Steelers had 2 tight ends. So the Bengals are trying to sell out to stop the run more because they figure, I'm assuming, that the Steelers are going to try to run, which they could have done. But instead, they caught the Bengals in like the perfect defensive scheme where they just ran a short 3-yard slant route on the outside to George Pickens. George Pickens had DJ Turner, number 20 for the Bengals, lined up over him. He beat him off the line of scrimmage, caught the ball, and then the safety for the Bengals coming down, Dax Hill, he missed George Pickens when he was trying to make the tackle. Instead of hitting George Pickens, Dax Hill hit his own player, DJ Turner, for the Bengals. And then Jermaine Pratt was trying to come in and make the tackle. He ran into them also. So all 3 of these Bengals ran into each other, took each other out. Meanwhile, George Pickens is completely by himself running all the way down the field for an 86-yard touchdown. Starting off the game in a terrible way. Then right after that, the Bengals come back. They're driving down. It looks like they got something going. They get into the red zone. It looks like, okay, the Bengals are going to for sure score at least a field goal, if not a touchdown, to tie this game back up. All of a sudden, Jake Browning scrambles outside of the pocket. He throws the ball up into the end zone. 3 Steelers are standing right there. Patrick Peterson catches it in the end zone for a touchback. And so after that point, the game was pretty much over because the Bengals, everybody on the sideline, if they weren't already deflated from the long George Pickens touchdown, they definitely were deflated from Jake Browning. And every time Jake Browning throws an interception, he hangs his head real low. He puts his head down. He unbuckles his chin straps, and he kind of walks off with his head, his eyes down towards his feet, kind of like George Michael in Arrested Development, where he's got like the sad walk. That's the Jake Browning walk coming off the field with these interceptions. You know, obviously you don't want him to be happy, but it would be body language is important here. You know, you want to show confidence that you're not distressed. You're not going to be, wavered by anything that happens on the field. These interceptions always look like they have like a psychological toll on Jake Browning. Hopefully that's just poor body language that they can work on with him, but it doesn't say a lot of positive things for your teammates when you're looking like totally dejected and then your teammates see you and they got to come back on the field and try to play defense or whatever. But pretty much all 3 of Jake Browning's interceptions were backbreakers. 2 of them happened in the first half. There's another one in the second half. But killer turnovers by Jake Browning. The other negative thing for the Bengals was Jake Browning came out and said he had a tough game. Chidobe Awuzie, the cornerback for the Bengals, also came out and said, put the game on me. I mean, that's a veteran thing for Cheeto to say. I wouldn't put the game on Cheeto. Yeah, he gave up a couple big plays to George Pickens. There was a couple plays in this game where it was getting towards the end of the first half. Mason Rudolph, it was like 3rd and 15. It looked like the Bengals had the Steelers stop. Maybe they were going to be able to get the ball back. Instead of that, the Steelers hit a long pass down the left sideline to George Pickens. It was an incredible catch by George Pickens. He was able to get separation on the sidelines away from Chidobe Awuzie. George Pickens has the size advantage and probably the speed advantage on Cheeto. George Pickens is a tough matchup for anybody. I don't care who you are, how good you are. maybe, Sauce Gardner would be like the only cornerback I could see that would realistically, physically match up with George Pickens because he's just so tall, long, strong, and fast. It's just like he's an alien type of player out there, freak athlete. There's not a whole lot, I could say that Cheeto could have done better. He tried his best to keep up with him, but it was just a perfect pass along the sidelines. And George Pickens did an amazing job of getting both of his feet in bounds while he's running backwards and falling out of bounds. He got both of his feet, he just barely got like by half of an inch, both of George Pickens' heels touchdown in bounds before he stepped out. So incredible play. Hard to fault Chidobe Awuzie for that. Maybe you could say he could have turned around, and if he could have seen the ball in the air, made a play on it. But you got to give the Steelers credit. They made a good play on that one. There's another play later in the game where Cheeto got beat on another long touchdown to George Pickens, where you could possibly argue it was offensive pass interference by George Pickens, where he kind of pushed off right at the end. But it was kind of a thing where both players had their arms up. They were kind of hand fighting with each other. Cheeto had his hand on George Pickens. Pickens had his hand on Cheeto. It was kind of a mutual interference. So if you're not going to call it on either one, I think that's probably the right call in that situation, even though it didn't go in the Bengals' favor. That one, yeah, Cheeto gave up the touchdown, but again, there was no safety help for Cheeto. He's one-on-one, and Jordan Battle was not even in the picture. I don't know if Jordan Battle is just slow to react or just slow in general, but he wasn't giving any help to Cheeto as a safety coming over there to try to force George Pickens out of bounds either. So I give Cheeto a lot of credit for stepping up and saying the game is on him, but obviously it's not all on him. There was no pressure in the backfield on Mason Rudolph while he's throwing these long, deep passes. Like maybe if there would have been a pass rush or a better blitz, it would have forced maybe a worse pass from Mason Rudolph to help Cheeto out a little bit on these outside, because he's one-on-one. And they asked Zach Taylor after the game, yo, what was up with your defense giving up all those touchdowns and long bombs? And he was just like, kind of shook, shrugged his shoulders and said, well, they won some one-on-ones against us. Yeah, obviously they won some one-on-ones, but why were they one-on-ones? How about two-on-ones? Why can't we get some other guys to help out the one-on-one when we're getting beat on all the one-on-ones? So it was just kind of some questionable defensive scheming by Lou Anarumo and the Bengals in this one, perhaps. But, without DJ Reader, their best player up front, they're going to be handicapped. Josh Tupou and Zach Carter were just getting absolutely blown away off the line of scrimmage. The Steelers' offensive line was dominating up front, so it's harder for all those defensive linemen to get their job done, which makes it harder for the linebackers, who did not have good games in this either. Logan Wilson and Jermaine Pratt were just slow to react to pass plays out of the backfield. They were getting beat on a lot of long plays. So just in general, Bengals defense had one of their worst games of the season. That did not help the fact that Jake Browning was throwing 3 interceptions. Normally, I would go through like every play, rewatch it, and kind of live commentate. I did that last time. It was okay, but I was mumbling way too much. If I'm going to do that again, I'm going to try not to mumble so much. So I won't do that this time. But let's just go through some of the highlights of the game. The thing that was so frustrating and so demoralizing was the Bengals. This is probably their worst first half of football I've seen them play in a while. This is the worst first half of the Zach Taylor coaching era. Bengals were losing this game 24-0 at halftime. And it's just so demoralizing and frustrating as a Bengals fan, because they're putting up all these statistics about how it's the best game for the Steelers under Mike Tomlin, and they haven't scored this many points in 3 years in the first half, and just going on and on and on about how great the Steelers are and how bad the Bengals are and how they're getting blown away. So that first half, you couldn't really expect the Bengals to come back from 24 points down in the second half. That would have been an amazing comeback, truly a miracle on Christmas, but you didn't really expect that to happen. We had seen them come back from 14 points down in the fourth quarter. That was, that 14 points, that's something remarkable right there. 24 points, pretty much insurmountable, especially because as soon as the second half started, it's when the rain started to get really heavy. And that's not good when you have Jake Browning, who, by the way, has the same size hands as Joe Burrow. Both Jake Browning and Joe Burrow have 9-inch hands, which is relatively small for NFL quarterbacks' hand size. Kenny Pickett, I think, has like 8 3/4 hands, so he's maybe like the only quarterback who has smaller hands, but Kenny Pickett wasn't playing in this game. But anyway, Jake Browning has small hands. There's no getting around it. And in the rain, it's small hands, it makes it even that much harder to throw the ball. So when they came out for the second half and they showed the rain coming down and they're already down 24-0, I pretty much knew at that point that the Bengals weren't going to have a whole lot of success. Now, to their credit, they did come out the first drive of that second half, and that's where they scored that long touchdown to T. Higgins. Basically, it was a similar type of bust for the Steelers defense. They were in cover 2. They let T. Higgins off the line of scrimmage free. Nobody really got in his way. T. Higgins ran a slant from the right side, caught it, and split the safeties and had the speed to outrun the safeties all the way to the end zone. So that was the highlight of the game for the Bengals. But outside of that, there was just not a whole lot going the Bengals' way. If we look at the drive charts, the results of each drive for the Bengals, let's look at the Bengals. Starting off the game, they went 6 plays, 22 yards, and punted the ball. That was the first drive of the game. 6 plays, they got a couple first downs, and then punt. Steelers came back and scored their touchdown right after that. 2 plays, scored the touchdown to George Pickens. The Bengals' second drive, where they're already down 7-0, they had an 11-play drive that went 59 yards. But then that's where Jake Browning threw the interception in the end zone, where they should have gotten at least a field goal. Instead, they came away with 0 and gave the ball back to the Steelers. Then on the Steelers' ensuing drive, they went 11 plays, 80 yards, all the way down the field, ended up with a Calvin Austin touchdown and around the left edge, where Jaylen Warren, number 30 for the Steelers, was the lead blocker on this play. And he absolutely annihilated the Bengals linebacker, Jermaine Pratt. This is the Steelers' halfback, tailback. He's smaller than Jermaine Pratt. I'm not sure what Jermaine Pratt was expecting to happen, but he was running like totally straight up. He wasn't like in an athletic position. He was like running straight up in the air and just got blown away, put completely on his back, pancaked at the goal line. He's supposed to be our starting middle linebacker, and he's getting pancaked by a running back at the goal line. Terrible job by Jermaine Pratt. Terrible job by the Bengals defense, letting up an easy walk-in touchdown. At that point, it's 14-0. Bengals defense is just getting blown off the field. At that point, I pretty much knew the game was over. The way the Bengals were playing in this on offense and defense was just pitiful. Bengals' next drive was stalled out by a bad pass right off the bat from Jake Browning, where he tried to throw it out to Joe Mixon in the flat, but he ended up losing yards. And then they got a sack after this that they had to punt the ball away. But that was one of the things that I noticed from Jake Browning. I don't know if it was the moisture from the rain or what it was, but a lot of inaccurate passes by Jake Browning in this game. Balls behind his receivers, behind Joe Mixon. There was one behind Andre Yosevich, one behind Trenton Irwin. A number of passes where the receiver that was open, but Jake Browning couldn't hit him in stride, threw it behind him. Either they caught it for a loss or it went incomplete. Just negative plays on throws that were easy plays for Jake Browning. He just totally missed. And that was the thing that was frustrating. There was plays to be had that were just not available because Jake Browning wasn't able to make the throws. Bengals defense did get a stop. They did force a punt. The Steelers didn't get like 3 touchdowns in a row to start off the game. That was one minor victory. But as soon as the Bengals got the ball back, they ran a couple plays, and then Jake Browning immediately threw another horrible interception. This one, maybe, I don't know which one was worse. The first one where he was trying to throw it out of bounds, or this one where he just completely misread the defense. I don't know what he was looking at. The Steelers were obviously in a zone defense. They had guys just dropping back into their zones, reading Jake Browning's eyes. And Jake Browning threw the ball like it was man coverage to, I think it was Tyler Boyd going over the left side. But he threw it straight at one of the Steelers defenders who was standing in his zone. Just poor vision, poor seeing the defense, reading the defense, not seeing the field well at all in this game for Jake Browning. I'm not sure what he was looking at on this play, but terrible interception, gave the ball right back to the Steelers, who drove it not even that far, who ended up returning that interception. I think it was down to about the 25-yard line or something like that. Maybe it was the 14-yard line. But right after that, they pushed the ball in for another touchdown, going up 21-0. This is still in the second quarter at this point. Bengals are down 21-0. They get the ball. They drive it 70 yards. This was the drive where Tyler Boyd got the 29-yard catch for the Bengals. And they had a couple other nice passes from Jake Browning on deep outs and passes over the middle to Drew Sample. They had one to Tyler Boyd, another pass to Trenton Irwin. They had the ball on the Pittsburgh 5-yard line, 2nd and 1 after a 9-yard pickup from Irwin. They had a pass out to the left to Irwin. This was the one that was behind Trenton Irwin. If it would have been a better pass from Jake Browning, he probably could have picked up the first down. For some reason, Jake Browning threw it behind Irwin, so he ended up getting tackled for no gain. The next play, Bengals tried to run it up the middle with Joe Mixon. Offensive line can't get any push on the Steelers defense. They get stopped. Brings up 4th and 1 at the Pittsburgh 5. For some reason, this is an odd play call. The Bengals tried to run a pass to T. Higgins on the left side where he was one-on-one with Joey Porter Jr., but it wasn't like a quick pass. It was kind of a long developing route, and Jake Browning didn't really throw a good enough pass. It was kind of a slant corner from T. Higgins. The ball was short. It came up short of where T. Higgins was. It should have been more towards the back pylon, and it ended up landing more towards the middle of the end zone in front of T. Higgins and Joey Porter Jr., and so it was incomplete. Bengals turn the ball over on 4th down. They don't get any points. So it's still 21-0. And then at that point, it was close to the end of the first half. Steelers drove it from there all the way down and kicked a field goal. 24-0 at halftime. Then the Steelers got the ball to start the third quarter. So I thought, oh man, the Steelers are really going to put the game out of reach at this point if they go up like 31-0. But to their credit, the Bengals defense got to stop the first drive of the third quarter. They got the ball back, and the Bengals' first drive of the third quarter, they ended up scoring on that 80-yard touchdown from T. Higgins. Like I said, it's a very similar play to George Pickens, just kind of a mirror image. One was from the left side to George Pickens for his 85-yard touchdown, T. Higgins from the right side for his 80-yard touchdown. Both slants, both plays where the defense kind of broke down, didn't get a hand on the receiver. Bengals ended up going for 2, so they got that. It was a nice play where Jake Browning was rolling out to his left. He saw Joe Mixon in the end zone. Instead of throwing it, he just did kind of a option pitch forward to Joe Mixon, caught in the end zone for the 2-point conversion. So at that point, it's 24-8. And if the Bengals, in theory, it was a 2-score game. They're only down by 16, 24-8. If they score 2 more touchdowns, convert 2 more 2-point conversions, they could, in theory, tie up the game. Of course, that didn't happen because as soon as the Steelers got the ball back, they went and scored another touchdown, a 66-yard touchdown this time to George Pickens on the left side, where he beat Cheeto. A little bit of a push-off, but he beat Cheeto, and then Cheeto wasn't able to make the tackle. Jordan Battle couldn't come over from his safety position to stop George Pickens before he got in the end zone. That made it 31-8 at that point. Once it got to be 31-8, it felt like the Steelers kind of played a little bit more conservative on defense. They were letting the Bengals move the ball. You know, it's kind of a bend but don't break type of defense. I think at that point the Steelers were more just trying to play for the clock, shorten the game just so they could run the clock out and get to the end of the game without letting the Bengals score a lot of points quickly. That's basically what they did. After the Steelers touchdown, Bengals got the ball. They were driving a little bit. They got a 43-yard drive going, but it stalled out on another 4th and long where it was just a bad pass again from Jake Browning. He had T. Higgins open on the left sideline, but just sailed it way out of bounds. T. Higgins caught the ball, but he couldn't even get 1 foot inbound, much less 2 feet inbound. So just bad pass, uncatchable pass from Jake Browning on 4th down that killed the Bengals drive right there. Steelers had another punt after that drive, gave the ball back to the Bengals. Still, the Steelers were up 31-8, and Bengals got the ball back. They had a 13-play, 46-yard drive that ended in a 35-yard field goal to make it 31-11 at that point. So the Bengals, instead of going for it, I think it was, at that point, it was 4th and 15 at the Steelers' 17-yard line. Instead of going for it, because it would have been 15 yards, basically they would have to throw the ball into the end zone. But instead of that, they went for a field goal. I'm not sure what the percentage is or what the analytics say there, but they're already down 31-8. A field goal at that point doesn't do them a whole lot of good because they still need to score at least twice. And at this point, it's getting into the fourth quarter, or this was 3 seconds left to go in the third quarter. So basically, only 1 quarter of play left to go. I don't know if this is the right call. If you want to be aggressive and try to win the game, you got to score touchdowns, not field goals at this late juncture. So maybe we could have said that the Bengals should have gone for it and just try to throw the ball in the end zone. Maybe they get lucky. Maybe they would get a defensive pass interference that would have extended them and helped the Bengals, get the ball on the 1 yard line. That probably would have been the play instead of this field goal, because even though they made it to make it 31-11, Bengals were still down by 20 points, meaning they still had to score 3 touchdowns basically within 1 quarter of play. That is going to be really tough to do that's going to be really tough ask to get the ball back from the Steelers, go like 3 and out basically every single time, get the ball back and score touchdowns on all 3 of your possessions and only in the fourth quarter. It seems unrealistic. So if there was a chance for the Bengals to win this game, they probably should have gone for it instead of kicking a field goal. But that's the feeling that I always get from Zach Taylor is if there's an opportunity to go for it and keep it close, or just kind of get some points on the board and make the score look a little bit better at the end, that's kind of what he would do. I think Sean McVay kind of did that when the Bengals played the Rams. He kicked a field goal instead of going for it, try to keep it close. This is even worse because the Bengals are getting totally blown away. You might as well just go for a touchdown. What's the point of kicking a field goal, getting 11 points, whoop-de-doo. But that's what they did, and that would be the Bengals' last points of the day. After this, the Steelers pretty much kept the ball away from the Bengals all of the fourth quarter. They got 1 more field goal to make it 34-11. Bengals couldn't do anything. And then with 4 minutes to go, Bengals are already down by 23 points. This is where they punt the ball away, which does not make any sense. But I guess the only thing you could say in the Bengals' defense of why they punted the ball there was on the 3rd down play right before this, Jake Browning got sacked, and he took a really hard hit from the Steelers where he got driven back into the ground. It looked like the back of his head slammed up against the turf when he went down. So I was a little bit concerned for Jake Browning on that play because it looked like it was such a hard hit. I would have been checking him out for a concussion, or I was just worried that he wasn't going to get up very quickly after that hit. So if I was Zach Taylor or somebody calling that, I would not have had a lot of confidence that Jake Browning would have been able to convert that 4th down anyway after taking such a massive hit. I would have been like, okay, Jake Browning, you may be concussed right now, so let's just get you off the field and we'll just punt the ball away. We're probably going to lose anyway, so let's not be crazy. I'll give Zach Taylor, some credit for it. In that situation, he probably shouldn't have punted it, but trying to, have his players back, not get anybody injured out there on doing anything crazy, gave the ball to Brad Robbins. And to his credit, that was Brad Robbins' best punt of the year. So good job, Brad Robbins. It almost worked out. They almost converted it into a safety, which probably wouldn't have mattered anyway. But, at least we got to see something good out of the Bengals, even though it was completely meaningless. Now, speaking of completely meaningless, after the game, Zach Taylor talked to the media, and he said absolutely nothing of interest as usual. Zach Taylor, after the losses, are even worse than after the wins. Not that he says anything anytime, but he just kind of like, aw, shucks, yeah, we got our ass whooped. They're like, Zach Taylor, what happened out there? Oh, yep, just, a better team than us. It was really humbling loss. They won their one-on-ones, and we couldn't get anything going on offense. Those 3 interceptions, just can't do that, and we'll get them next week. Just, not really a satisfying answer to any question from Zach Taylor. He's just kind of like, yeah, aw, shucks, they got us. That's how it goes. Just kind of matter of fact. Doesn't seem that worried about it. He doesn't seem like that upset. Doesn't seem surprised at all. He seems like almost like he expected to get blown away by the Steelers. That's what happens. That's what we do. We don't win these divisional games. We're about to go 0-6. We're going to lose to the Browns. That's how we do. So I don't want to take really anything out of a Zach Taylor press conference because they're all totally meaningless. Hopefully this coming week they'll have a better plan for the Chiefs, but I'm a little bit scared because the Bengals have played the Chiefs so frequently in the last few years in the playoffs and in the regular season that it's almost like a divisional opponent. They've played them pretty much just as many times as they played the Steelers and the Browns and the Ravens. So the Chiefs are very familiar with this Bengals team, And you got to expect that they're going to have a game plan that's designed and tailored for Zach Taylor and his offense. Hopefully the Bengals have some different tricks up their sleeves, something. They got to get this season turned around if they want to do anything. This loss was bad. Hopefully they can bounce back. And let's just say that this is a bad matchup. Maybe it's just the Steelers have the Bengals number this year. They have Jake Browning's number this year. But outside of that, Jake Browning's played pretty well. So hopefully if it's a game not against the Steelers, this team will play better. We know they play pretty well against the Chiefs, but that was when they had Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase and DJ Reader and all those guys. It's going to be a much bigger challenge for this Bengals team to go up against those Chiefs. And we'll have to see what the Bengals do with this extra day of rest. Since they played on Saturday, they're going to have 8 days instead of the traditional 7 because they're going to play next Sunday against the Chiefs. Maybe that extra day of rest, give them a little time off, spend time with the family on the holidays, recharge the batteries, come back refreshed, and play a better game because they did not play very well against the Steelers. One other side note before I forget, in this game, this is the broadcast on NBC against the Steelers had Noah Eagle and Todd Blackledge calling the game, and it wasn't terrible, but I think it's because Noah Eagle sounds so much like his dad. It's like I said, the Kenny Albert, Marv Albert situation. Noah Eagle, for some reason, I think it's because he was so young that he was trying to sound like more mature. He sounded very subdued. There wasn't a lot of energy and excitement in any of his calls. He was competent. He was calling the game, he was calling the right players, calling the right downs and distances, all that kind of stuff where you could keep track of the game and follow along. But just something about his voice just kind of irked me. It rubbed me the wrong way. Maybe it's kind of the thing where you go to the store and you buy like the off-brand flavor of some kind of food or drink, like you buy the off-brand Coke from the store and it tastes similar, but it's not quite the same. It's not what you were expecting. It's not what you know from the brand So I know Ian Eagle. He's one of my favorite announcers. And Noah Eagle is similar, but he's just not quite the same. He doesn't have the energy. He doesn't have the enthusiasm. Obviously, he doesn't have the experience. He's not as polished as his dad. So give him some time. Maybe Noah Eagle will grow on me a little bit more. But first impressions were not that great. It kind of left a weird aftertaste in my mouth, like kind of an off-brand Coke you get from the store. Todd Blackledge, I thought, did a pretty decent job of calling the game. Not horrible, not the best, but one of the things I thought was funny about this was he had a comment about George Pickens that I even said on the preview episode. After George Pickens scored all his touchdowns, obviously the fans in Pittsburgh were going crazy cheering for George Pickens, but this had been the whole week where fans and reporters were writing a bunch of stories about how George Pickens doesn't have any effort, he doesn't want to block and get injured, he's not a team player, George Pickens has attitude problems, all this kind of stuff. So it was just great to hear Todd Blackledge on the broadcast say, none of these fans in this Acrisure Stadium right now give a flip whether George Pickens blocks or not. And that's absolutely true. It's like, if you're out here having 200 yards receiving, scoring 2 touchdowns, you could never block. Nobody would care at all. So that's exactly what happened in this game. I'm sure people are going to forget about George Pickens blocking until he does it again. But as long as the Steelers are winning, he's scoring touchdowns, having 200 receiving yards in a game, nobody cares at all. Like they say, it's a week-to-week league. You can change the narrative real quick. So all the people who are riding on the Bengals train and saying how Zach Taylor should get Coach of the Year and all this kind of stuff, that's probably going to die down a little bit. And all the people who are saying Mike Tomlin for the Steelers should be fired and they need to clean house and do all that stuff, maybe if the Steelers keep winning and they make it to the playoffs, a lot of that noise will die down too. Not that this is a Steelers podcast, but one other interesting thing about this game was, if you noticed in the game, George Pickens, he had 2 mouth guards, which is totally bizarre. I've never seen a player have 2 mouth guards, and they're both hanging off the front of his face mask. So you got the strap around the mouth guard that goes around the face mask and acts as an anchor, so the mouthpiece dangles down. You can reach up and grab it and put it in your mouth. But the thing that was weird was George Pickens had one mouth guard in his mouth, and then he had another one hanging off of his face mask. I noticed on his touchdown, he was running down the field, he had this red face mask dangling, flying all over the place. I was like, that's so weird, because it annoys me when players do this most of the time, like Zay Flowers, where they have the mouth guard hanging out all game. They never put the mouth guard in. I thought that's what George Pickens was doing, but he had one mouth guard in, one mouth guard out. I was like, what is this? Why does he have one in, one out? Well, when he took both mouth guards out, you could see he had one green mouth guard, one red mouth guard. So he was going Christmas theme. He had red and green mouthpieces for Christmas. I don't think I've ever seen something like that. So it was such a weird thing, but I mean, it worked for him. So maybe he'll do it some more. This isn't a Steelers podcast, so no more Steelers talk, but everybody's talking about the Steelers after that win. Nobody's talking about the Bengals. Bengals are back on the back burner. People are acting like the Cinderella story is over. Jake Browning is turning into a pumpkin and whatever. I mean, that's kind of a short-sighted take on it because really the only thing that happened was they got beat by the Steelers twice. They got beat by the same team with similar results both times. They're probably not going to have to play the Steelers any more times this season. So let's just say that those games were just Steelers games. We'll put those off on their own island and say otherwise this Bengals team and Jake Browning have played pretty well. So let's not expect every game from here on out to be a carbon copy of this Steelers game. They're probably going to perform much better from here on out. I'm not going to say they're going to win all the games. They're definitely not going to be favored, I wouldn't imagine, in the rest of these games. But I think they'll be more entertaining than this Steelers game. This was one of the worst games of the season to watch. No fun at all. I felt like it was miserable the entire game. So if anything, hopefully it will just be an entertaining, fun game to watch. But we'll come back with a preview of the Week 17 game against Kansas City next time. If you're still listening to this far into the episode and you enjoy this show, I wanted to remind you to subscribe, turn on your notifications, share it with a friend so we can grow the podcast a little bit more, and send me your comments. Let me know, what do you think about this upcoming Chiefs game? What do you think about this Steelers game we just saw? What do you think about Zach Taylor, Jake Browning, and this team going forward? I want to know what you think. I'm trying to know my audience a little bit better here. So send me your comments. You can send them in the comments below or hit me up on Twitter at Bengal Bites, and I'll be sure to read your comments on our next episode where we preview this game against the Kansas City Chiefs. But until next time, I'm going to leave you with a hoo-day and stay hungry for more Bengal Bites.